Between 1935 and 1945, deep within the frozen plains of occupied Manchuria, the Japanese Imperial Army built a facility that would become one of the darkest secrets of the Second World War. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, a name meant to sound harmless. In truth, it was a laboratory of death, where science was twisted into a weapon, and thousands of men, women, and children were reduced to test subjects. Behind its walls, doctors conducted experiments so horrific that even decades later, few believed they had truly happened. This is the story of Unit 731, Japan's hidden laboratory of war, and one of history's most chilling examples of science without humanity.
To understand how Unit 731 came into existence, one must first understand the broader context of Japanese militarism in the early 20th century. Following the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Japan embarked on rapid modernization and industrialization, transforming itself from a feudal society into a major world power within a single generation. By the 1930s, Japan's military increasingly dominated the government. Ultranationalist ideology promoted the concept of Japanese racial superiority and the nation's divine right to lead Asia. Military leaders viewed territorial expansion as essential for securing natural resources and establishing what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a euphemism for Japanese imperial control over much of Asia and the Pacific. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. This marked the beginning of what would become the Second Sino-Japanese War, merging eventually with the broader conflict of World War II. The invasion of mainland China provided both the territory and the human subjects that would make Unit 731 possible. During this period, international agreements existed to prevent the use of biological and chemical weapons. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use of such weapons in warfare, and Japan had signed this agreement. However, the protocol contained no enforcement mechanisms and did not explicitly ban research or development of these weapons, only their use in combat. Japanese military strategists recognized that their nation lacked the vast natural resources of potential adversaries like the Soviet Union and the United States. Biological and chemical weapons represented a potential equalizer, offering devastating destructive power without requiring massive industrial capacity. This strategic calculation, combined with an ideology that dehumanized non-Japanese populations, created the conditions for Unit 731's creation.
The architect of Unit 731 was Surgeon General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist who joined the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps in 1921. Ishii was intelligent, ambitious, and possessed a talent for persuading military leadership to fund his research proposals. After studying at Kyoto Imperial University, he traveled abroad to study biological warfare programs in other nations, becoming convinced that such weapons would be decisive in future conflicts. Ishii recognized that international prohibitions on biological weapons actually confirmed their potential effectiveness. He argued to his superiors that Japan needed to develop these capabilities to avoid falling behind other powers who might secretly be conducting similar research. His persuasive abilities, combined with the military's growing influence over government policy, secured substantial funding for his projects. The first incarnation of what would become Unit 731 was established in 1932 in the Jiangma fortress near Harbin in occupied Manchuria. This initial facility, known as the Togo Unit, began conducting preliminary research. However, a 1934 escape by several prisoners led to the facility's exposure and subsequent closure. Rather than abandoning the program, military leadership ordered the construction of a much larger, more secure facility. In 1936, construction began on a massive complex in the village of Pingfang, approximately 20 kilometers south of Harbin. The new facility would become the headquarters of Unit 731, officially designated the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The name was deliberately misleading. Any outside observer would assume the facility's purpose was protecting Japanese troops from disease, a mundane but necessary military function. In reality, the complex housed laboratories, animal breeding facilities, crematoria, and prison blocks designed to hold hundreds of human subjects simultaneously. The Pingfang complex eventually covered approximately 6 square kilometers and included over 150 buildings. Thousands of personnel worked at the facility, including doctors, nurses, technicians, and support staff. The operation required massive resources, including dedicated railway connections for transporting supplies and prisoners. Ishii surrounded himself with talented scientists and physicians, many recruited from prestigious Japanese universities. These were not uneducated sadists, but trained medical professionals who willingly participated in operations that completely abandoned the fundamental principle of medicine: first, do no harm. They referred to human subjects using the term maruta, meaning logs, linguistically transforming people into inanimate objects. The Pingfang complex functioned as a small city dedicated entirely to biological warfare research. At its peak, Unit 731 employed approximately 3,000 personnel, with perhaps an equal number of support staff working in satellite facilities throughout occupied China and Korea. The facility's layout reflected its dual purpose of appearing legitimate while conducting classified operations. Administrative buildings, barracks, and recreational facilities occupied the outer areas, presenting a normal military installation appearance. The central section contained the laboratories, animal testing facilities, and the special prison blocks where human subjects were confined. Prisoners arrived regularly by train, transported from various locations throughout occupied territories. The Japanese military police, known as the Kenpatai, arrested individuals on various pretexts, often without any genuine criminal charges. Chinese resistance fighters, suspected spies, political dissidents, and even civilians caught in random sweeps found themselves delivered to Unit 731. Soviet soldiers captured during border conflicts also numbered among the victims. Upon arrival, prisoners lost their names, receiving only numbers. The dehumanization was intentional and complete. Guards and researchers viewed subjects not as human beings, but as experimental materials, no different from laboratory mice or culture samples. The research conducted at Unit 731 covered multiple areas of biological and chemical warfare development. Scientists cultivated large quantities of deadly pathogens, including plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and other infectious diseases. They developed methods for weaponizing these agents, creating bombs, shells, and dispersal devices designed to spread infection across wide areas. To test the effectiveness of these weapons and study disease progression, researchers deliberately infected subjects with various pathogens. No anesthetic was provided for invasive procedures. Physicians performed operations to observe the effects of infections on different organs and body systems. They justified these actions by claiming that anesthesia would interfere with research results, though the real reason was simply that the lives and suffering of subjects held no value in their eyes. Beyond biological agents, Unit 731 investigated the effects of extreme conditions on the human body. Researchers exposed subjects to freezing temperatures to study hypothermia and frostbite, particularly interested in developing treatments for Japanese soldiers fighting in cold climates. They conducted decompression experiments, simulating high-altitude conditions. They tested the effects of starvation, dehydration, and various forms of physical trauma. The facility also performed weapons testing using human targets. Researchers needed to determine the effective range and lethality of various weapon systems, and they used living subjects bound to stakes at different distances. Flamethrowers, explosives, and various munitions were tested this way, with physicians carefully documenting the resulting injuries. Women prisoners faced additional horrors. Researchers conducted experiments related to reproduction, deliberately infecting pregnant women to study disease transmission to unborn children. Some subjects were forcibly impregnated for research purposes. The complete absence of ethical constraints meant that no form of suffering was considered off-limits if it might yield data deemed useful. The scale of operations required sophisticated infrastructure. The facility included massive incinerators to dispose of bodies, with crematoria running continuously. Researchers killed subjects when they no longer served experimental purposes or when they grew too weak to provide useful data. No prisoner ever left Unit 731 alive through release. The only way out was through the smokestacks. Production facilities within the complex manufactured biological weapons in quantity. By 1939, Unit 731 could produce up to 300 kilograms of plague bacteria monthly, along with substantial quantities of other pathogens. This was not merely research, but operational weapons production, ready for deployment in combat.
Estimating the total number of victims remains difficult due to the systematic destruction of records at the war's end. Conservative estimates suggest at least 3,000 people died in the Pingfang facility alone, while some researchers believe the true number may exceed 10,000 when including satellite facilities and field tests. Beyond those who died in the laboratories, Unit 731 tested its weapons in operational conditions. Between 1940 and 1942, Japanese aircraft dropped plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, including Ningbo and Changde. The resulting epidemics killed thousands of civilians. In one documented case, the city of Changde experienced a massive plague outbreak after Japanese aircraft dropped grain mixed with infected fleas in November 1941. Contemporary Chinese sources reported hundreds of deaths in the immediate aftermath, with the epidemic continuing for years afterward. The deployment of biological weapons created uncontrollable consequences. Disease does not respect boundaries or allegiances. Japanese troops sometimes fell victim to their own weapons. In one incident, approximately 1,700 Japanese soldiers died from epidemic disease after biological weapons use in the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign of 1942. The military command accepted these losses as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of strategic objectives. The demographics of victims reflected the Japanese military's racist ideology. The vast majority were Chinese, viewed by Japanese ultranationalists as racially inferior and therefore suitable for experimental use. Koreans, whose nation Japan had colonized in 1910, also numbered among the victims. Soviet prisoners captured during border conflicts represented another significant group, reflecting the tensions between Japan and the Soviet Union throughout this period. Some evidence suggests that Allied prisoners of war, including Americans, may have been transferred to Unit 731, though documentation remains limited. The full scope of the facility's operations likely will never be completely known due to the thoroughness of the cover-up. Children were not spared.
Some estimates suggest that several hundred children died in Unit 731 facilities, either because they were arrested alongside parents or because researchers specifically wanted to study pediatric responses to various conditions. The complete moral bankruptcy of the operation extended even to the most innocent victims. Women constituted approximately 30% of victims, according to survivor testimonies and available records. They endured all the standard horrors of the facility, plus additional violations specific to their gender. The intersection of medical experimentation and systematic assault created layers of trauma that defied adequate description. Every victim had a life before arriving at Unit 731. They had families, dreams, daily routines, and individual personalities. The dehumanization inherent in the operation attempted to erase these realities, reducing human beings to numbered specimens. Yet each number represented a person whose suffering and death should be remembered and acknowledged.
Unit 731 did not confine its operations to the Pingfang complex. The unit deployed biological weapons in multiple campaigns throughout China, creating devastation that extended far beyond military targets. The plague attacks on Chinese cities represented calculated attempts to spread disease among civilian populations. Japanese aircraft would fly over cities and release specially designed ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas. The bombs were designed to break apart at low altitude, dispersing the fleas widely. Local flea populations would then spread the disease further, creating sustained epidemics. The city of Ningbo experienced such an attack in October 1940. Japanese aircraft dropped wheat and rice mixed with infected fleas, along with contaminated material in several locations. Within weeks, plague cases began appearing. The epidemic lasted for months, with estimates of casualties ranging from 99 to 500 deaths directly attributable to the attack, along with countless additional cases from secondary spread. These attacks violated both international law and basic humanitarian principles. The deliberate targeting of civilian populations with biological weapons had no military justification. The goal was terror and destruction, inflicting suffering on Chinese civilians as a form of collective punishment and strategic warfare. Unit 731 also contaminated water supplies in areas where Chinese forces operated. They introduced cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne pathogens into wells, rivers, and reservoirs. This tactic proved difficult to control and sometimes affected Japanese troops as well, but military leadership deemed the risk acceptable. The unit conducted field tests using human subjects in various locations throughout occupied territories. They would infect prisoners with diseases and then release them into populated areas to observe disease spread patterns. This practice treated entire communities as experimental laboratories, with local populations unknowingly participating in research without consent or protection. Some operations involved distributing contaminated food supplies. Unit 731 operatives would distribute dumplings, candy, or other foods infected with pathogens to civilian populations, then return later to observe and document the results. These operations often targeted children, who were more likely to accept free food from strangers. The cumulative death toll from Unit 731's field operations far exceeded the number who died within facility walls. Some historians estimate that biological warfare attacks may have killed as many as 200,000 Chinese civilians, though precise numbers remain impossible to verify. The long-term effects of epidemic spread by these attacks persisted for years after the war ended.
As Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, following the Soviet declaration of war against Japan, the staff of Unit 731 received orders to destroy all evidence of the facility's true purpose. The cover-up operation was extensive and thorough, revealing that leadership understood the criminal nature of the operations. Personnel destroyed documents systematically, burning records and smashing equipment. They killed the remaining prisoners, leaving no witnesses who could testify about what had occurred. Explosive charges demolished key buildings. The crematoria worked overtime, incinerating final evidence of the human cost. Shiro Ishii ordered the facility's personnel to scatter and return to Japan, instructing them never to discuss their work. He told subordinates that if they remained silent, the secret could be kept indefinitely. The systematic destruction and dispersal occurred over several days in mid-August 1945 as Soviet forces approached Harbin. When Soviet troops arrived at Pingfang, they found a partially destroyed complex with little obvious evidence of its true purpose. Some buildings remained standing, and Soviet investigators eventually pieced together aspects of what had occurred. However, the destruction was sufficiently complete that the full scope of operations remained unclear. The Soviet military captured several low-ranking Unit 731 personnel who had not escaped quickly enough. These individuals provided limited testimony, but senior leadership successfully fled to Japan. The Soviets eventually conducted a war crimes trial in 1949 in Khabarovsk, prosecuting 12 captured personnel. However, this trial received little international attention, dismissed in the West as Soviet propaganda during the emerging Cold War. Meanwhile, the United States had its own interest in Unit 731. American occupation authorities in Japan quickly learned about the biological warfare program through intelligence gathering. They faced a decision: prosecute the perpetrators for war crimes or exploit their research for American military purposes.
General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Japan, oversaw the occupation and reconstruction of the defeated nation. His administration made a calculated decision that would haunt historical justice for decades: grant immunity to Unit 731 personnel in exchange for exclusive access to their research data. American military scientists recognized that Unit 731 had conducted experiments that would be impossible to replicate under ethical constraints. The data represented thousands of human experiments providing information about disease progression, weapons effectiveness, and biological warfare capabilities. In the emerging Cold War context, with tensions rising between the United States and the Soviet Union, this information appeared strategically valuable. Investigators from the United States Army and the newly formed U.S. Biological Warfare Program at Fort Detrick interviewed Shiro Ishii and other senior Unit 731 personnel extensively. The interrogations occurred in secret, away from international observers and war crimes investigators. The Japanese scientists provided detailed reports about their research methods and findings in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The deal was explicit: full disclosure of all research in exchange for protection from war crimes trials. American authorities paid Japanese scientists for their reports, essentially purchasing silence about one of the war's worst atrocities. The total payment has been estimated at approximately $250,000, a significant sum at the time, distributed among various researchers. This decision meant that, unlike Nazi war criminals prosecuted at Nuremberg, Unit 731 personnel faced no accountability. Shiro Ishii lived freely in Japan until his death from throat cancer in 1959. Other senior personnel resumed normal lives, with some continuing careers in medicine, academia, and business. Several former Unit 731 scientists held positions in Japan's post-war pharmaceutical industry and medical establishment. The justification offered was strategic necessity. American officials argued that preventing the Soviet Union from obtaining this information outweighed other considerations. They claimed that prosecuting the scientists would push them toward the Soviets, who were also seeking information about Japanese biological warfare research. The decision reflected the moral compromises that characterized the early Cold War period. Former enemies became potential allies, while former allies became potential adversaries. Strategic calculations overrode justice for victims. The same nation that had prosecuted Nazi doctors at Nuremberg for human experimentation protected Japanese doctors who had committed comparable crimes. The immunity deal remained classified for decades. General MacArthur's headquarters deliberately excluded information about Unit 731 from the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Asian equivalent of the Nuremberg trials. Investigators who specifically asked about biological warfare programs received misleading or incomplete answers. The research data acquired through this deal proved less valuable than anticipated. Much of the information was poorly documented or contaminated by methodological flaws. The studies lacked proper controls, and the conditions under which they were conducted made the data difficult to apply to practical military applications. Nevertheless, the immunity was permanent and irrevocable.
For decades after the war, Unit 731 remained largely unknown outside specialist circles. The American classification of related documents, combined with Japanese reluctance to confront wartime atrocities, kept the story suppressed. Victims and survivors lacked platforms to share their experiences, and the few who tried to speak out found little audience. In Japan, post-war society focused on rebuilding and moving forward rather than examining dark chapters of the recent past. Unlike Germany, which eventually undertook extensive efforts to confront Nazi crimes, Japan's reckoning with wartime atrocities proceeded much more slowly and incompletely. Textbooks minimized or omitted uncomfortable historical facts. Many Japanese citizens remained genuinely unaware of Unit 731's existence well into the late 20th century. The first significant break in the silence came in 1981, when journalist Seiichi Morimura published a book exposing Unit 731's activities. The book became a bestseller in Japan, forcing public acknowledgement of facts that had been suppressed for decades. Morimura's work relied on interviews with former personnel who, approaching the end of their lives, were willing to discuss their wartime activities. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, additional evidence emerged. Former members of Unit 731, now elderly, began providing testimonies. Some expressed remorse, while others remained defensive, arguing they had simply followed orders or claiming their work had scientific value. These testimonies revealed the bureaucratic normality with which extreme violations had been committed, showing how ordinary people could participate in extraordinary evil within institutional structures. Chinese survivors and family members of victims also began speaking publicly, though their voices often received less attention internationally than those of perpetrators. The suffering of victims remained marginalized in many historical accounts, which focused more on the scientific and strategic aspects of the story than on the human cost. In 1997, several Japanese peace activists established a museum in the former site of Unit 731 in Harbin, China. The Museum of Evidence of War Crimes by Japanese Army Unit 731 preserves parts of the original complex and displays artifacts, documents, and testimonies. The museum serves as an important memorial to victims and an educational resource about this chapter of history. Legal efforts to obtain recognition and compensation for victims have largely failed. In 1997, Chinese survivors filed a lawsuit in Japanese courts seeking acknowledgement and reparations. Japanese courts have consistently rejected these claims, citing statutes of limitations and the legal immunity granted through post-war treaties. As of the early 21st century, no formal compensation has been provided to Unit 731 victims or their families. The Japanese government's official position has evolved slowly. For many years, officials denied or minimized Unit 731's activities.
More recently, there has been limited acknowledgement that the unit existed and conducted human experimentation, though debates continue about specific details and the extent of operations. Conservative politicians sometimes deny or downplay the evidence, creating ongoing tensions with China and other nations. The discovery of buried remains near the former Pingfang site has provided physical evidence of the facility's activities. Construction projects in the area have occasionally uncovered human bones and other artifacts. Forensic analysis of these remains confirms that they show signs of experimental procedures and violent deaths, corroborating testimonial evidence.
The story of Unit 731 raises profound questions about medical ethics, scientific responsibility, and the relationship between research and morality. How do educated medical professionals abandon their ethical training and commit such violations? What conditions enable systematic cruelty to become normalized within institutions? The physicians and scientists of Unit 731 underwent the same training as their colleagues who never participated in such activities. They studied anatomy, physiology, and the principles of medicine. They took oaths to use their knowledge for healing. Yet they applied their expertise toward inflicting suffering and death, transforming medicine from a healing art into an instrument of destruction. Several factors enabled this transformation. The ideology of racial superiority dehumanized victims, making it psychologically easier to treat them as experimental subjects rather than patients. The military chain of command diffused individual responsibility, allowing participants to view themselves as merely following orders. The secrecy of operations prevented outside scrutiny that might have prompted reflection or restraint. The pursuit of knowledge became separated from ethical constraints. Researchers convinced themselves that the scientific value of their work justified the means. They focused on technical aspects of their experiments, treating them as intellectual puzzles to solve rather than human suffering to inflict. This compartmentalization allowed them to maintain professional identities as scientists while committing crimes against humanity. The immunity granted to Unit 731 personnel sent a troubling message about the value of scientific data versus human rights. By prioritizing access to research over prosecution of crimes, American authorities suggested that information gained through unethical means retained legitimacy and utility. This decision has haunted discussions of research ethics ever since. Modern medical ethics codes, including the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, explicitly prohibit the kinds of research conducted at Unit 731. These standards emerged partially in response to the revelation of Nazi medical experiments, though ironically not in response to Unit 731, which remained classified when these codes were developed. The principles of informed consent, minimization of harm, and respect for human dignity now form the foundation of ethical research. The question of whether data obtained through unethical means should ever be used remains contentious. Some argue that using such data dishonors victims and suggests their suffering had value. Others contend that refusing to use available information compounds the tragedy by ensuring that suffering produced nothing of benefit. This debate continues in medical ethics discussions.
The legacy of Unit 731 extends beyond the specific historical events to broader lessons about human nature, institutional accountability, and the prevention of atrocities. Understanding this history requires confronting uncomfortable truths about what humans are capable of under certain conditions. One crucial lesson involves the dangers of dehumanization. When ideologies define certain groups as fundamentally inferior or less than fully human, extreme violations become possible. The language used by Unit 731 personnel, referring to human subjects as logs, exemplified this dehumanization. Similar patterns appear in other genocides and mass atrocities throughout history. The role of institutional structures in enabling atrocities deserves attention. Individual cruelty alone cannot produce operations on the scale of Unit 731. Such programs require bureaucracies, budgets, supply chains, and organizational hierarchies. Many participants performed mundane administrative or technical tasks, never directly inflicting suffering, but enabling those who did. The banality of evil, as philosopher Hannah Arendt termed it, appears clearly in the Unit 731 story. The failure of accountability in the aftermath represents another critical lesson. The immunity granted to perpetrators demonstrated that strategic calculations could override justice. This created a precedent suggesting that sufficiently valuable knowledge or cooperation could provide immunity from prosecution regardless of the severity of crimes. The message sent was that certain crimes could go unpunished if perpetrators possessed information desired by powerful nations. The long suppression of the Unit 731 story highlights the politics of historical memory. For decades, political considerations kept this history hidden from public awareness. Japanese reluctance to confront wartime crimes, combined with American classification of related documents, created a decades-long silence. Only persistent efforts by journalists, activists, and survivors eventually brought the story to wider attention. The challenges of achieving historical reconciliation remain evident. Disagreements persist about how Unit 731 should be remembered and commemorated. Tensions continue between Japan and China over historical acknowledgement of wartime atrocities. These disputes demonstrate how difficult it can be for societies to achieve shared understanding of painful histories. For medical professionals, Unit 731 serves as a stark reminder of the importance of ethical foundations in scientific practice. The transformation of healing into harm occurred when practitioners severed the connection between technical expertise and moral responsibility. Modern medical education increasingly emphasizes ethics precisely because history has shown the consequences when this dimension is neglected. The story also illustrates the limitations of international law and agreements. Despite the existence of the Geneva Protocol prohibiting biological weapons, Japan developed and used such weapons extensively. The lack of enforcement mechanisms meant that prohibitions existed only on paper. This pattern has repeated throughout history, with international agreements often proving ineffective without robust enforcement.
Unit 731 stands as one of the darkest chapters of the Second World War, a place where medicine was twisted into a weapon and human life reduced to material for war. The experiments, the use of biological weapons against civilians, and the cover-up that followed reveal how easily science and morality can collapse under ideology and ambition. The tragedy of Unit 731 lies not only in the suffering of its victims, but in the fact that ordinary doctors and scientists became perpetrators, not through madness, but through obedience and belief in a cause. Their crimes were systematic, justified as research, and protected by political convenience when the war ended. Unlike their Nazi counterparts, most of Unit 731's members escaped justice. Their victims never received recognition or compensation, their suffering silenced for decades. Yet the lessons remain urgent. When ethical boundaries are ignored, When certain lives are seen as expendable, humanity itself becomes the test subject. Remembering Unit 731 is more than preserving history. It is a warning. It reminds us that progress without conscience leads only to destruction, and that the duty to remember is inseparable from the duty to prevent such horrors from ever happening again.
Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to the channel.